this video lecture will examine the concept of internal validity, which is core to any kind of research design, in particular experiments, but for non-experimental studies as well. So what is internal validity? We define this as the ability to show that the treatment, also known as X, also known as our independent variable, actually causes Y to change. So say we see a change in Y. Is this change in Y actually reflective of a causal effect of X? Or could we say that there's actually something else going on? Is there really some kind of confound that's at play that makes it look like X causes Y? So in other words, can we really develop any kind of meaningful causal inference from our study? And there can be problems with internal validity that could be due to three different categories of problems. So first, they might be due to the subjects of the study themselves. Second, they might be due to some kind of problem with the administration of treatment. And third, they could be due to the researcher, him or herself. So to go through this example, or go through this concept, we're going to talk through an example. And this is looking at negative campaign ads and political cynicism. So suppose you have a hypothesis that people who are exposed to negative campaign ads are more likely to become politically cynical. And you think this is a causal relationship, that the more people are exposed to these negative campaign ads with their dirty messages, it makes people more and more negative about politics overall. They might think, well, it doesn't matter whether I vote or not because everything is bought and paid for. It doesn't matter if I participate in any way politically. It doesn't matter who I vote for because they're all corrupt and they're all terrible people. And so here your independent variable, your treatment, is exposure to negative campaign ads, and the dependent variable is your level of political cynicism. And if you're doing this study, if you simply did an observational study and asked people how much they've been exposed to negative campaign ads and whether they were cynical, you might be capturing something very different than the effect of the negative campaign ad, because people who've been exposed to negative campaign ads were probably pretty different than those who hadn't been. There might be people who watch television a lot. There might be people who are more politically engaged, that they pay attention when a campaign ad would come on. And so how do you assess what's the real effect of exposure to the campaign ads and not say some other causal effect that might make people happen to be exposed to campaign ads and happen to be more cynical? So how do you really get the causal relationship here? So you might decide to do an experiment in which you have people in a laboratory environment and expose them to negative campaign ads, and then do a test afterwards, a survey that asks them about their level of political cynicism using a variety of public opinion questions. All right, so this is your experimental design. So we're going to talk through some potential ways that you might see problems with internal validity arise with this kind of study. So first of all, I'm going through the category of problems with internal validity of subjects. We might have a problem with the selection of our subjects. Namely, we might find that the treatment and the control groups are different on potential confounds. So remember, we have selected our treatment and control groups, and then we randomly assigned them into treatment and control to make sure that they are equivalent on confounds. And so here we see the control group, or the dark gray, and the red is the treatment group. And you can see here that both have 4 women and 5 men. So they look basically the same. Well, the problem with this is that you need at least 25 subjects in both treatment and control in order to be able to have any expectation of equivalence. So if you have too small of a number of people, you might have a problem with selection, in that you might, just by chance, have, say, more women than men in your treatment group than in your control group. And maybe women tend to react differently to the campaign ads than men would. So this would mean, in other words, that you weren't simply assessing the effect of exposure to campaign ads. You would also be assessing the effect of, say, gender on levels of political cynicism. So you need to have selection effects controlled for, and you need to have a decent number of subjects in both treatment and control to get at this. Another potential problem could be what's called differential mortality, which is that members of the treatment group drop out more than those in the control group, or vice versa. Maybe members of the control group are more likely to drop out. So if we say each person here represented 10 people, right? It could be that you have, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this is 90 people, say. Well, what if 20% of people in the control group dropped out and only 10% of people in the treatment group dropped out? Maybe this is because, with our example, that they are exposed to a placebo that's just a bunch of commercials, and they say, well, this is boring. This isn't worth my time. I don't see how this is helping me, and they don't finish the study. Meanwhile, people in the treatment group are more interested in the study, and they keep going. And so if you have a difference between the treatment and control group in this respect, it could be a problem. In particular, when those that drop out are different from those that do not. If you randomly had, say, 10% of the control group drop out and 8% of the treatment group drop out, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem unless the people who drop out are different than those who don't. So maybe the people who drop out are more likely to be lower income, and they're making decisions about their time constraints. Well, if they're more likely to drop out in one of those groups than the other, that can be a big problem for your study, because again, then all of a sudden, your treatment group has wealthier participants than your control group, and maybe you're assessing the effect of wealth on levels of political cynicism, not simply exposure to the campaign ad. Another threat to internal validity on the subject side is what is known as the Hawthorn effect. And we talked about this with the external validity lecture as well, which is that people behave differently than normal when they know that they are being observed. And so there's another effect going on here. If you have subjects that know that they are being analyzed and assessed, they may pay extra attention to that campaign ad. They may be extra diligent, and if they have a sense that you're looking for changes in political cynicism, well, they may say, well, yeah, I'm going to give that answer to the researcher. And so they're going to behave differently. And what this means is that you, once again, are testing for simply the effect of this negative campaign ad on levels of political cynicism, but you're really capturing some other factor involved. That's really just due to the effect of subjects knowing that they're in the study. So you're looking, once again, at the independent variable of exposure to the ads plus another potential variable, which is willingness to please the researcher. You can also have threats to internal validity that come through the treatment, through the administration of the treatment that's done by the researcher. So one of these types of threats to internal validity is called the history effect, which is that something unexpected happens in the middle of the experiment to one of the groups, say the treatment group, but not the control group, or it could be vice versa. So I found this cartoon that is an example of history, which is that somebody decides to sneak in and give LSD to the control group. And so here you're assessing the effect of exposure to those campaign ads, as well as the effect of not having LSD for the treatment group. And the control group isn't really a control group. They have LSD. And so this would obviously change people's responses. So history, typically it's not accidental exposure to LSD, but if there's something that happens in the middle of the experiment, it might make the groups no longer equivalent in terms of how they're experiencing that treatment. They're getting exposure to something else besides simply your independent variable. Another factor could be diffusion of X. And this means that you have a diffusion of treatment. So somehow the control group accidentally receives treatment. And this could be something silly, like the researchers mix up the groups and they also give the control group the tape that has the ads on it. Or it could be something like if people who are in the the treatment group come out and start talking about the ads to the control group, maybe those conversations will make those in the control group more cynical, right? So if people who've been exposed to these negative campaign ads say, yeah, boy, Obama, he says that he's a clean politician, but he's just like the rest of them. I saw this ad, and they say this to their friend who was in the control group who was simply watching, a Coke commercial. That may make the person who watched the Coke commercial more cynical, in which case you've had this diffusion, this spread of the effect of that negative campaign ad. Another treatment-based threat to internal validity is the testing effect. So we talked about this already when we discussed the different kinds of experimental designs, the Solomon 4 research design. So the testing effect is when having a pretest causes a change in the dependent variable. And so for this, you might imagine that you gave them a pretest that included a number of questions about levels of political cynicism. And that could have primed the respondent. So you ask them, are all politicians the same? Does it matter if you vote? No matter what? Do you believe that money controls all of politics? And by asking them these questions, you made them start to think a little bit more cynically. So then, when they're exposed to the negative campaign ad, they're basically primed to become more cynical by virtue of being exposed to that. So you kind of put them in a bad mood or put them in a more cynical mood, and then that triggers a more negative effect. So in other words, you are in this testing the effect of your independent variable, exposure to the campaign ad, as well as the factor of exposure to that initial test. And there can be threats to internal validity that come from the researcher herself. So, namely, experimenter bias, which is that results are biased because the researcher wants to see the effect. They may overinterpret something that they see. They may say, if they're doing interviews with a respondent, say, wow, the person seems really cynical. They may not even know that they're doing it. And this is why we have double-blind studies. So a double-blind experiment is when neither the patient knows that they are part of the experiment, nor does the researcher know that they are part of or know which group is in treatment and control. They know that there's an experiment, of course. And so the patients, some of them will be getting a placebo effect, and some of them will be getting the actual treatment. And so you don't tell the subjects exactly what you're studying. You tell them that you're looking at the effect of advertising, something really generic like that. And one of the groups, the treatment group, gets exposed to the campaign ads. The other group gets exposed to a Coca-Cola commercial. So both are exposed to advertising, but the group that sees the Coke commercial doesn't know that they are simply in the control group. And then the researcher, the way that you would do this is that you would have the groups leave that room where they watch those ads, and they go to another room, and then another researcher who doesn't know whether the group that's in front of them is treatment or control, then that researcher assesses people's responses on a political cynicism survey. And so you have it set up in advance, and then people are anonymized, that they don't know themselves whether they're treatment or control, and the researcher doesn't know when they're administering that survey after the fact who is in treatment or control. So these are different types of problems with internal validity that you can have, and the key is to focus on the general intuition here of, can we really assess that there's something causal that's happening, or could there really be some other factor that we need to consider instead?